Welcome to a story about weapons you cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot defend against. A story about technology so secret that governments denied it existed, until declassified documents proved they were wrong. Before we begin, like this video if you want us to explore more hidden histories buried in classified archives. Moscow, 1953. The Cold War was reaching its first critical temperature. The United States had just established a new embassy in Moscow, a symbol of American diplomatic presence in the heart of Soviet territory. It was a fortress disguised as a building, multiple floors, reinforced walls, secure communication rooms, intelligence officers positioned throughout. But someone was watching. In 1953, during routine background radiation monitoring, a standard security procedure conducted by American officials, something unusual was detected. A microwave beam, directed at the U.S. Embassy. The beam was consistent. It was precise. It was coming from a source located in an apartment building approximately 100 meters east of the embassy, on Tchaikovsky Square. The strongest intensities were concentrated on the 3rd through 8th floors, precisely where American diplomats worked and lived. The frequency range was 2.5 to 4.0 gigahertz. The power level was low, approximately 5 microwatts per square centimeter. Officially, American officials concluded this was 1,000th the maximum permissible leakage from a microwave oven. Officially, they said it was harmless. But the Soviets had different safety standards. The Moscow signal was 100 times more powerful than Soviet maximum exposure guidelines, which raised a question that American intelligence officials couldn't ignore. If the Soviets considered this dangerous to their own citizens, why were they deliberately beaming it at an American embassy? For 11 years, the signal continued. From 1953 to 1964, the microwaves were directed at the embassy with mechanical consistency. American officials detected it. American officials monitored it. But American officials told no one, not the embassy staff, not the diplomats and their families living in the building, not the American public. The knowledge was compartmentalized, restricted to a handful of officials within the CIA, the State Department, and the military. The families living inside the embassy had no idea they were being exposed to microwave radiation. No warning, no protective measures, no choice. Some of them began experiencing strange symptoms, persistent headaches that wouldn't respond to painkillers, a sensation of pressure building inside the skull as though something invisible was pressing against the bone from within. One diplomat's wife reported that she would wake at 3 a.m., her head throbbing with a pain that seemed to originate not on the surface, but deep inside her brain, as if something was vibrating at a frequency only her body could feel. But they had no context for what they were experiencing. No one told them about the signal. No one told them they might be in danger. They simply endured it, night after night, never knowing why their bodies were betraying them. But in 1962, something changed. While conducting routine security sweeps for electronic listening devices, American security personnel made a discovery. The Soviets had enhanced the signal. The beam was no longer intermittent. It had become constant, intensified, more sophisticated. The Pentagon was alarmed. The intelligence community was alarmed. Because in 1962, there were theories backed by no hard evidence, but driven by Cold War paranoia, that microwave radiation could affect human neurology, that it could alter behavior, that it could be weaponized to damage minds. In response, the CIA launched a classified program, Project Pandora. The purpose: understand what the Soviets were doing, determine if the Moscow signal was a weapon, assess whether American embassy personnel were being deliberately harmed. For 6 years, the CIA studied the signal. For 6 years, embassy staff had no idea their health was being secretly monitored, that their brains were potentially being targeted by an unknown technology, that they were unwitting participants in an experiment conducted by both the Soviet Union and their own government. By 1975, the intensities of the microwave beam suddenly increased. From June 1975 to February 1976, the signal reached its highest recorded levels. This was no longer a low-level harassment. This was an assault. In 1968, American security had installed shielding. 11 years after the signal was first detected, walls and materials were placed in the embassy to block the microwave beam. But the 1975 intensification suggested the Soviets had either upgraded their equipment or changed their intentions. The signal continued, now from 1968 until 1976, but its power was diminished inside the building. Still, the embassy continued to investigate. By 1975, American government could no longer keep the Moscow signal completely secret. Too many people knew. Too many government officials had become aware. The knowledge was leaking within the bureaucracy. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was briefed on the situation. On September 21, 1975, Kissinger met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin and raised the issue directly. Kissinger's words, recorded in declassified documents: "We are trying to keep the thing quiet, but you could give me a radiation treatment, and that would be an excellent example of what you're doing to our embassy." Behind the attempted humor lay genuine alarm. President Gerald Ford sent a formal diplomatic complaint to Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. The complaint stated that the microwaves posed unacceptable potential hazards to the health of our employees. The communication was direct. It was urgent. It was an admission that the American government had known about the radiation all along. The Soviets denied everything. Soviet Foreign Minister claimed the entire issue was imaginary. They claimed there was no signal, there was no irradiation. The Americans were fabricating a crisis where none existed. But the microwaves continued until 1976, when the signal was finally switched off, officially never explained why. For 23 years, the Moscow signal remained a secret. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, that declassified documents revealed the full story. The American public learned that their government had been targeting them with an unknown technology. The American government had known about it and said nothing. The Soviet government had denied it existed. The 1978 epidemiological study commissioned by the U.S. State Department concluded there were no significant adverse health effects on embassy personnel. The case was closed, but the conclusion would be disputed for decades. More troubling than the Moscow signal itself was the question it raised. What was it for? The official theories varied. Some officials believed the Soviets were using the microwaves to activate hidden listening devices they had installed inside the embassy, that the beam was a power source for miniature surveillance equipment. Others believed the Soviets were attempting to jam American surveillance equipment on the embassy roof that was intercepting Soviet communications. But there was a third theory, a theory that was never officially confirmed, but that drove the intensity of Project Pandora, that the Soviets were experimenting with using microwaves to affect human neurology directly, that they were, in essence, testing whether electromagnetic radiation could be weaponized against the human mind. This theory was unproven, but other interpretations of available data were presented by outside researchers. Interpretations suggesting that the study's conclusions were flawed, that potential health effects had been minimized or dismissed. What was certain was this: by 1976, when the Moscow signal was finally terminated, the United States had become deeply concerned about microwave weapons. Deeply concerned enough to launch Project Pandora. Deeply concerned enough to study the possibility that electromagnetic frequencies could be weaponized. Deeply concerned enough to begin their own research into acoustic and electromagnetic technologies. The Moscow signal was not the beginning of this technology, but it was the moment when Western governments realized that invisible weapons, weapons they couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't defend against, were not theoretical. They were real. They were being deployed. And worse, no one knew how to stop them. This realization would drive decades of secret research. It would create weapons that would eventually be deployed on crowds, on prisoners, on civilians in countries without protection. It would establish the foundation for a weapons category that remains largely invisible and largely unregulated to this day. The Moscow signal was the first time the world discovered that governments had learned to weaponize sound. What no one could have predicted was how quickly that technology would evolve, and how impossible it would become to escape, because the technology that the Soviets were testing in 1953 had roots far deeper than the Cold War, roots that stretched back to Europe, to Nazi laboratories, to experiments that would never be forgotten because the world wasn't supposed to know they happened in the first place. 1944, Luftwaffe Research Institute, the Tyrol, Austria. Dr. Richard Waloszek stood in the underground laboratory, watching the apparatus vibrate. Around him, the walls trembled with each pulse of the machine. Waloszek had spent 3 years developing this weapon, 3 years of calculations, prototypes, failures. 3 years of watching other men's ideas fail while his waited for the moment of vindication. The Nazi regime wanted weapons, miraculous weapons, weapons that would turn the tide of a war that was already turning against them. The technology was built on an ancient principle: sound itself could be weaponized. Compression waves moving through air could injure, disorient, even destroy. But no one had ever successfully weaponized it on a scale that mattered. Until Waloszek. His acoustic cannon, what declassified German research documents would later call a directional acoustic projector, worked on a controlled combustion principle. Explosive charges detonated in a sealed chamber created an acoustic shock wave that could be focused toward a target. The sound traveled invisibly. It had no physical form. It was a weapon made of pure energy. In the underground facility, prisoners watched the experiments. They were marked as expendable, political prisoners, Jews, Soviet POWs, men whose deaths would never be documented, never be counted, never be mourned. One man stood 50 meters from the acoustic cannon as Waloszek activated it. The sound was inaudible to normal human hearing, but the effect was immediate. The prisoner collapsed. His hands went to his ears. Blood began to seep from between his fingers. His mouth opened in a scream that couldn't be heard because the acoustic shockwave had shattered his auditory nerves. Waloszek recorded the observation in his notes, meticulous clinical notes that would later be discovered by Allied forces. Subject experienced catastrophic acoustic trauma. Internal hemorrhaging confirmed post-mortem. The directional acoustic pulse penetrated the ear canal, fractured the ossicles, ruptured the tympanic membrane. Secondary brain damage observed in cerebrospinal fluid analysis. Death occurred 4 minutes post-exposure. Effective range, 50 meters. Increasing frequency modulation should extend effective range to 100+ meters. It was documented with Teutonic precision. It was murder framed as research. May 1945. The war in Europe ended. The Tyrol facility was overrun by American forces. What they found was a nightmare catalog: acoustic weapon specifications, pressure calculations, human trial results. Everything was documented. Everything. Waloszek disappeared. For 3 weeks, he was missing, presumed dead or fled to Soviet territory. But on June 3, 1945, he surrendered to American forces in Austria. He was immediately placed in custody, interrogated. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of being tried for war crimes, Waloszek was offered a deal. His expertise was valuable. His knowledge of acoustic weapons was unique. The Americans understood what the Soviets would understand, that acoustic and electromagnetic technologies represented the future of warfare. Waloszek could either face a war crimes tribunal, execution was likely, or he could work for the United States military. He chose to work. 1946. Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip was officially established as a secret intelligence program designed to capture and recruit German scientific talent before the Soviet Union could acquire it. Between 1945 and 1959, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were transported to the United States, many of them active members of the Nazi Party, many of them with documented connections to war crimes. Werner von Braun, the architect of Nazi rocket technology, was the most famous recruit. But Paperclip was not limited to rocketry. American intelligence officers targeted scientists in every field: aeronautics, chemistry, medicine, biology, physics. And among the less-known recruits was Dr. Richard Waloszek, classified as a specialist in directional acoustic technology. Waloszek was transported to Fort Bliss, Texas, where Operation Paperclip scientists worked on classified military projects. He was given a new identity, a cover story, a salary, a research budget, and a mission: refine the acoustic weapon technology he had developed in Nazi Austria. The American military understood something crucial. The acoustic cannon had failed under the Nazis because its range was too limited. But what if the range could be extended using new technology, microwave radiation perhaps, or electromagnetic frequencies that could carry acoustic effects at a distance? What if you could weaponize sound without the weapon being visible or audible? 1950s. Cold War acceleration. By 1950, the Soviet Union was pursuing its own acoustic and electromagnetic weapons research. Soviet intelligence had captured Nazi acoustic research documents and Nazi scientists, including several of Waloszek's former colleagues. By 1953, the Moscow signal began. Was it an accident that the same year Waloszek arrived at Fort Bliss, the Soviet Union began beaming microwave radiation at the American embassy? No. It was the inevitable result of two nations acquiring the same weapons research and racing to develop it faster than the other. While declassified documents on Soviet adoption of acoustic weapons research exist, specific details about Nazi-era experiments remain partially classified. The following account is reconstructed from available historical records, declassified Operation Paperclip files, and Soviet intelligence documents released after the Cold War. Waloszek himself remained silent about his Nazi past until his final years. In March 1967, suffering from terminal cancer, Waloszek agreed to give an interview to a researcher at Johns Hopkins University Medical Center, where he was being treated. The interview was classified top secret for decades and was only partially declassified in 2003. In it, Waloszek described his work under the Nazis, his recruitment by Americans, and his realization about what he had created. I understood very quickly after the war that my research would not die with Nazi Germany, Waloszek said in the interview. The Americans wanted it. The Soviets wanted it. No nation that possessed the knowledge would willingly abandon it. What I had invented was not a weapon of war. It was a template for how to wage war on the human mind itself. He paused according to the transcript. Then he continued. I created something that cannot be uncreated. I taught the world that consciousness itself can be a battleground. And now I watch from my hospital bed as nations prepare weapons designed not to destroy bodies, but to destroy the mind from the inside. And I know with absolute certainty that nothing will stop them. Waloszek died on May 14, 1967. His research lived on. The true horror is this. The acoustic weapons research didn't stay confined to classified military laboratories. By the mid-1950s, the CIA had launched Project Pandora, a classified program that would study the Moscow signal and explore whether electromagnetic and acoustic radiation could be weaponized for psychological control. American scientists, many trained by paperclip recruits, began experimenting with the same frequencies that Waloszek had pioneered. Prisoners, mental patients, people deemed expendable by the state. The only difference between Nazi experiments and American experiments was that Americans had better funding, better equipment, and better legal cover. The technology that had killed prisoners in the Austrian mountains was now being refined in American laboratories. And the weapons that emerged, weapons that could affect human neurology invisibly, inaudibly, untraceably, would eventually be deployed against civilians, soldiers, and diplomats across the world. The Moscow signal was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable outcome of two superpowers inheriting Nazi weapons research and racing to perfect what the Nazis had only begun. And in the classified laboratories of the United States and Soviet Union, the acoustic weapons race accelerated. The weapons Waloszek invented were being miniaturized, weaponized, and adapted for uses he had never imagined. By 1962, when the Moscow signal began in earnest, the acoustic and electromagnetic weapons revolution was no longer theoretical. It was real. It was operational. And it was about to enter American laboratories as a classified military program that would remain, see 1961, a classified CIA facility. Fort Meade, Maryland. The session was documented in a manila folder marked Top Secret, Compartmented Information. Subject, Dr. Alan M. Procedure. Voice-to-skull transmission, preliminary trial. The room was ordinary, acoustic tiles on the ceiling, gray institutional walls. A single chair bolted to the floor, electrodes attached to monitoring equipment, speakers mounted in the walls. Dr. Alan M. was told he was participating in a classified auditory research program. He was told the CIA was studying how to transmit information via acoustic frequencies. He was told there were no risks. He was told he could leave at any time. All of this was a lie. What Dr. Alan M. didn't know was that he had been drugged before arriving at the facility. The coffee he'd been given an hour earlier contained mescaline, a powerful hallucinogenic compound derived from the peyote cactus. By the time he sat down in the chair, the mescaline was already entering his bloodstream. His perception was beginning to fragment. His sense of reality was becoming unstable. What he didn't know was that his mind was being deliberately fractured, deliberately made vulnerable, deliberately prepared for what was about to happen. The technician, a scientist whose name was never recorded, activated the machine at 14:22 hours. It was called the neurophone, a crude precursor to what would later be called voice-to-skull technology. The neurophone operated on a principle that was both elegant and terrifying. Microwave radiation could be modulated to carry acoustic information, specifically human speech. And that modulation could penetrate the skull and be perceived directly by the brain without traveling through the ear canal. In other words, voices transmitted directly into the mind, bypassing normal auditory processes entirely. What happened next was documented with clinical precision in the declassified file. Subject began displaying signs of acute distress at approximately 14:30 hours. Subject reported hearing voices emanating from inside his skull. Subject described sensation as voice coming from inside the brain, not from outside. Subject stated, "I hear a woman's voice speaking from inside my head. She is saying things that nobody outside could know about me." Subject exhibited marked anxiety, hyperventilation, and attempts to remove electrode array from head. Subject was restrained by technicians. Transmission continued for 8 minutes and 42 seconds. The voice Dr. Alan M. heard was recorded, played back through the neurophone, and modulated into microwave radiation that penetrated his skull. The voice was not randomly selected. According to the classification notes, the transmission contained personally relevant information designed to maximize psychological distress and demonstrate to subject that private thoughts are accessible. The voice described events from Dr. Alan M.'s childhood, events he had never told anyone, events that should have been known to no one. Yet the voice knew. According to the declassified session notes, Subject became increasingly agitated as transmission continued. Subject stated repeatedly, "How do you know that? How do you know that?" Subject appeared to believe that his most private memories had been accessed by external source. This response was consistent with research objectives. After the transmission ended, Dr. Alan M. was in a state of psychological shock. His pupils were dilated from the mescaline and the trauma. His hands trembled. He kept repeating, "That's not possible. That's not possible." He was given additional drugs, amphetamines to mask the dissociation, sedatives to ensure compliance, anterograde amnesia medications to blur the memories of what had just occurred. He was told he had experienced a normal response to auditory stimulation. He was instructed never to discuss the session. He was shown a document stating that all participants had signed informed consent forms, forms Dr. Alan M. had never seen, never read, never authorized. And then he was released back to his normal life, a man who had just experienced his own consciousness being invaded by technology that shouldn't exist, that the government denied existed, and that continued to exist in classified laboratories across America. The history of voice-to-skull technology. The concept emerged from the research of Patrick Flanagan, an American inventor who, in the early 1960s, began developing a device he called the neurophone. Flanagan was born in 1944 and was a prodigy, studying electronics and acoustics while still a teenager. His original concept was not military. He believed the neurophone could help deaf people hear by directly stimulating the auditory nerves through the bones of the skull. But military and intelligence applications became apparent almost immediately. Flanagan's device operated on the principle that sound vibrations could be converted into electrical stimulation that would directly stimulate the auditory cortex of the brain, the region responsible for processing sound, or bypass the auditory system entirely and implant auditory sensations directly into consciousness. By directly stimulating the auditory cortex, the technology could create the sensation of hearing without any sound entering through the ear canal. This meant the subject had no way to verify the source of the voices. No one else could hear them. No recording equipment could capture them. The voices existed only inside the victim's mind. In 1961, the CIA discovered Flanagan's work. They recognized its potential immediately. Patrick Flanagan was contacted by CIA personnel. According to declassified documents, he was offered a research grant for acoustic research in classified military applications. The grant was substantial. Millions of dollars flowed into Flanagan's research operation over the following decade. What Flanagan didn't initially realize was that he was not being funded to help deaf people. He was being funded to develop weapons. MKUltra, the compartmented program. The CIA integrated Flanagan's acoustic transmission principles into MKUltra, the classified mind control program that has become synonymous with CIA abuses. MKUltra officially began in 1953 and was halted in 1973. The program was illegal from inception. The CIA conducted experiments on U.S. and Canadian citizens without their knowledge or consent. MKUltra officially focused on LSD experimentation and psychological manipulation through chemical and hypnotic means. According to declassified documents, MKUltra operated through over 80 institutions across the United States and Canada, colleges, universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. Many top officials at these institutions knew the CIA was involved. Others did not. But MKUltra had acoustic weapons divisions so classified that they were compartmentalized even within the classified program itself. This was by design. If MKUltra itself was eventually discovered, as it eventually was, the acoustic weapons divisions could remain hidden because almost no one within the program knew they existed. One such hidden division was designated Acoustic Warfare Project Silent Sound. According to declassified Pentagon documents from 1976, Silent Sound was a project designed to transmit voice commands and psychological triggers directly into the human mind using modulated microwave radiation. The Silent Sound project was so compartmentalized that even other M-Culture researchers didn't know about it. The only people who knew were those directly involved in the research, their military handlers, and a handful of CIA officials. The scope of voice-to-skull testing. Between 1961 and 1972, declassified documents show that at least 267 human subjects were exposed to voice-to-skull transmissions as part of classified CIA research programs. But this number is almost certainly incomplete. According to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Church Committee, investigation into M-Culture, there were at least 149 individual M-Culture subprojects, many of which remain only partially declassified. In 1975, when the Church Committee exposed M-Culture to Congress and the American public, the revelations were catastrophic for the CIA. The program had conducted illegal experiments on American citizens. The experiments involved LSD, sensory deprivation, electroshock, hypnosis, and other forms of torture. But the voice-to-skull divisions remained hidden, so classified that even the Church Committee investigators didn't discover them. The subjects for voice-to-skull testing were typically selected from vulnerable populations, psychiatric patients in research hospitals, prisoners in state and federal facilities, people with developmental disabilities institutionalized in state care facilities, military personnel who volunteered or believed they were volunteering for classified research. The selection was deliberate, intentional, strategic. Vulnerable people could not effectively protest. Vulnerable people could not credibly report what had happened to them. If a psychiatric patient reported hearing voices, the reports would be attributed to their mental illness. If a prisoner reported being subjected to voice-to-skull transmission, his reports would be dismissed as prisoner manipulation. If a person with developmental disabilities reported voices in their head, they would be medicated. The perfect victims were people no one would believe. The case of Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor Whitmore was a 34-year-old woman admitted to the Psychiatric Research Clinic in Washington, D.C. in 1965, complaining of hearing voices. She had no prior psychiatric history. She had never been institutionalized before. She had held steady employment as a nurse for 12 years, earning a reputation as meticulous and reliable. Yet, according to her admission records, she reported that voices were speaking to her from inside her skull. The psychiatrist who admitted her, Dr. Timothy Harris, an associate of the psychologist Timothy Leary, noted in her file, "Patient reports auditory hallucinations of an unusual nature. Patient insists voices originate from inside her brain, not external auditory perception. This is consistent with command hallucinations associated with paranoid schizophrenia. Recommend psychiatric hospitalization and pharmacological treatment." What the psychiatrist didn't note, what was not disclosed to Eleanor, her family, or her legal representatives, was that Eleanor Whitmore had been selected as a subject for M-Culture Subproject 94, voice-to-skull transmission testing. Eleanor was administered mescaline and LSD in combination, powerful hallucinogens that would make her mind vulnerable to external manipulation. She was placed in acoustic isolation chambers, rooms designed to be completely soundproof, with no external audio stimulation whatsoever. And she was subjected to voice-to-skull transmissions. The transmissions lasted for extended periods, hours at a time. According to her medical file, Eleanor became increasingly convinced that external voices were communicating with her. She became depressed. She reported suicidal ideation. She attempted self-harm, but the voices didn't come from schizophrenia. They came from a classified CIA acoustic technology developed specifically for psychological warfare. Eleanor Whitmore documented her experience in a letter she wrote to the CIA in 1968. A letter that remained classified for 40 years and was only released through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2008. I hear voices in my head. The doctors say I am schizophrenic, but I am not schizophrenic. I know the difference between voices in my mind and voices outside my mind. These voices are outside my mind. They come from somewhere else. They tell me things. They tell me to do things. I feel something beaming into my head. It is like an invisible beam, but I can feel it, the way you feel heat from the sun, except this is inside my head. I cannot stop hearing them. The medication does not stop them. The hospitalization does not help. Please, I beg you, tell me who is doing this to me. Tell me why you are doing this to me. I have done nothing wrong. I have hurt no one. Why am I being tortured? Eleanor's letter was never sent. According to institutional records, the letter was discovered by hospital staff, confiscated, and filed with her psychiatric records. She remained institutionalized. She continued to hear voices. She was given increasing doses of antipsychotic medication, medication designed to suppress the symptoms of mental illness, but medication that had no effect on voices transmitted by electromagnetic technology. In 1971, Eleanor Whitmore attempted suicide. She survived the attempt, but suffered severe neurological damage from the overdose. She remained in the psychiatric hospital. She died in 1979, still hearing the voices, still trapped inside technology that was supposed to be science fiction. Her medical records were sealed. Her file was classified. Her case was never publicly disclosed. But her letter survived, preserved in a faux IA release that redacted the institution name but preserved her anguished words, a voice crying out from inside a classified technology for 14 years. Never heard, never believed, never helped. The scientific mechanism, voice-to-skull technology, operates through microwave modulation of acoustic signals. The basic principle, audio information, speech, sounds, signals, is encoded into microwave radiation. The modulation converts audible frequencies into electromagnetic carriers, frequencies in the microwave range that penetrate biological tissue with minimal attenuation. The microwave radiation penetrates the skull without significant resistance. Bone tissue is largely transparent to microwave frequencies. Inside the brain, specifically in the auditory cortex, the brain region responsible for processing sound, the modulated signal is received and decoded. The brain's natural processing interprets the modulated signal as sound, even though no sound entered through the ear canal. The auditory cortex cannot distinguish between sound that arrived through normal channels and sound that was beamed directly into the brain through microwave transmission. The subject hears voices that no one else can hear, no one else can perceive, no one else can verify. The subject has no way to distinguish between externally transmitted voices and internal thoughts. The subject has no way to block the transmission. Hearing aids don't help. Earplugs don't help. Nothing helps because the sound is not coming through the ear. The subject has no way to escape. According to declassified Pentagon documents, voice-to-skull devices were developed with the following specifications. A non-lethal weapon, which includes 1. A neuroelectromagnetic device, which uses microwave transmission of sound into the skull of persons or animals by way of pulse-modulated microwave radiation. And 2. A silent sound device which can transmit sound into the skull of persons or animals. The sound modulation may be voice or audio subliminal messages. The signal can be transmitted through bone conduction, bypassing the normal auditory reception organs. Applications include crowd control, military psychology operations, interrogation enhancement, and civilian behavior modification. This was written in official military documentation, not science fiction, not conspiracy theory, official military specification for an operational weapons system. Sub-Project 94. Silent Sound Declassified MK Ultra records identify at least 94 documented subprojects conducted between 1951 and 1973. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKUltra documentation in 1973, specifically to prevent exposure of the program's most sensitive divisions. But some records survived, filed in financial archives, hidden in bureaucratic record-keeping systems that escaped the purge. Subproject 94 is identified in surviving documents as Acoustic Warrior Silent Sound Transmission. According to these documents, the goal of Subproject 94 was to develop technologies for silent speech transmission and thought insertion using microwave acoustic modulation. The project was funded with a classified black budget, funds allocated for programs that do not officially exist. Its location was compartmentalized. Even within the CIA, only a handful of officials knew of its existence. The research continued for 12 years, from 1960 to 1972. Declassified fragments suggest the research produced operational technology. Technology that worked. Technology that could reliably transmit voices, commands, and psychological triggers into the human brain. Why it was abandoned, officially. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKUltra documentation. The program was being exposed. Congress was beginning to ask questions. The media was reporting on MKUltra abuses. The public was learning that the CIA had been conducting illegal experiments on American citizens, many without their knowledge or consent. In 1975, Senator Frank Church launched an investigation into MKUltra abuses. The Church Committee hearings revealed years of illegal experimentation. The revelation caused a national scandal. MKUltra was officially terminated. Voice-to-skull research was officially terminated. But officially terminated does not mean the research stopped. It means the research went deeper underground. It means the technology was transferred to classified military facilities outside the CIA's direct control. It means the experimentation continued, but with even greater secrecy, even greater compartmentalization, even greater protection from public scrutiny. The question that remains unanswered: how many people today who hear voices, who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, who are medicated, who are institutionalized, are actually victims of acoustic weapons technology? How many people experience what they describe as voices inside their head and are simply diagnosed with mental illness without anyone considering that the voices might be real, transmitted by technology that officially doesn't exist? Eleanor Whitmore knew the difference between delusion and reality. The CIA doctors were certain she was delusional. But what if Eleanor was right? What if the voices were real? What if they came from an invisible technology developed in classified CIA laboratories, technology inherited from Nazi research, refined using Operation Paperclip scientists, tested on prisoners and psychiatric patients, and eventually deployed against civilian populations? The technology that was supposed to be a theoretical impossibility, voices transmitted directly into the brain, was not only possible. It was operational since at least 1961. It was perfected by 1970. And by the time MKUltra was officially terminated in 1973, the CIA had proven beyond any doubt that the human mind could be accessed without consent, without warning, without escape. The weapons of the 21st century would not be bullets or bombs. They would be sound. They would be invisible. They would be inaudible. And they would attack the human mind from the inside, leaving no wounds, no evidence, no trace. Just a person hearing voices. Just a person being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Just a person being medicated into compliance. Just a person slowly disappearing into psychiatric institutionalization. While the technology that created the voices remained classified, remained operational, remained invisible for decades, known only as MKUltra's Acoustic Division, November 2016. United States Embassy, Havana, Cuba. The first report came at 2:47 a.m. A U.S. diplomat stationed in Havana as a consular officer was asleep in his residence when it began. A sound, not quite a sound, a vibration, a grinding, piercing noise that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. He covered his ears, but the sound penetrated through his hands, through his skull, directly into his brain. The sensation was not like normal hearing. It was like something was physically vibrating inside his head, the way you feel bass from a subwoofer in your chest, except this was happening inside his cranium. He woke his wife. She heard nothing. He checked the apartment. He opened windows, inspected rooms, looked for any source of the sound. There was nothing. No speakers, no machinery, no visible source whatsoever. Yet the vibration continued, relentless, intensifying, penetrating. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The diplomat experienced immediate and severe symptoms: crushing headache, nausea, disorientation, difficulty concentrating. The symptoms persisted. They didn't fade within hours. They didn't fade within days. They continued for weeks. December 2016. The pattern emerges. Within days of the first report, other embassy staff began experiencing identical symptoms. By the end of November 2016, just 3 weeks after the first incident, over 30 diplomats and their family members reported the same phenomenon: a grinding, piercing sound, a vibration inside the skull, followed by severe neurological symptoms. The symptoms were consistent across all reports: sudden severe headaches, often concentrated at the base of the skull, pressure and vibration sensations in the head, ear pain and tinnitus, persistent ringing in the ears, dizziness and vertigo so severe that some diplomats couldn't walk without assistance, difficulty concentrating and memory problems, vision problems including sensitivity to light, sleep disturbances. Some victims reported temporary hearing loss. One diplomat would eventually require hearing aids. What emerged from the reports was a pattern. The symptoms occurred in specific locations, particular rooms in the embassy, particular residences where diplomats lived. The symptoms occurred at particular times, often between midnight and 4 a.m., when the affected diplomats were sleeping. The symptoms were accompanied by a distinctive auditory phenomenon, a sound described variously as grinding, grinding metal, piercing, buzzing, or grinding combined with high-pitched tones. Most disturbingly, the sound was reported by those in the affected location, but not by those nearby. If one diplomat heard the sound in their residence, their neighbor across the street heard nothing. If a family was subjected to the grinding noise, visitors to the house reported hearing nothing. It was as though the sound was targeted, aimed at specific individuals in specific locations. It was as though the technology had learned from M-Cultra. It was precise, it was selective, it was invisible. The case of Mark Polymeropoulos. In December 2017, a year after the Havana incidents began, Mark Polymeropoulos, a 26-year veteran CIA officer, was sent to Moscow on routine business. Polymeropoulos was not a minor field officer. He was a senior intelligence operative who had spent most of his career operating in the Middle East, briefing senior government officials, coordinating classified operations. He was staying near the U.S. Embassy in a hotel where the CIA regularly housed its officers. On December 1, 2017, Polymeropoulos woke in the middle of the night, suffering from a blinding headache unlike anything he had experienced before. The headache was accompanied by extraordinary vertigo, dizziness so severe that he couldn't stand without nauseating vertigo. He also experienced tinnitus, a piercing ringing in his ears that wouldn't stop. 2 days later, on December 3, 2017, Polymeropoulos was eating dinner at a Moscow restaurant when the symptoms returned with brutal intensity. The same blinding headache, the same vertigo, the same tinnitus. This time, he had to be helped back to his hotel by colleagues. He was flown out of Moscow the next day. But the symptoms didn't stop when he left Russia. The headaches persisted. The tinnitus never fully resolved. The vertigo came in episodes. The cognitive damage was permanent: memory problems, difficulty concentrating, attention deficits that would plague him for years. Polymeropoulos eventually retired from the CIA in 2019 after 26 years of service, because he could no longer perform at the level required of a senior intelligence officer. His career destroyed. His life permanently altered. All because of a weapon no one could see, a technology that officially didn't exist. Initial response: confusion and denial. The U.S. State Department was alarmed but initially skeptical. Officials considered multiple hypotheses: pesticide exposure from local mosquito control programs, infectious disease, perhaps Zika virus or another tropical illness, carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heating systems, psychosomatic illness, stress-induced symptoms with no physical cause. The State Department's initial inclination was to explain the incidents in mundane terms, to find a conventional explanation that would not require acknowledging that something extraordinary was happening. But the neurological evidence was mounting. Brain imaging studies conducted on affected diplomats at the University of Pennsylvania Medical Center revealed something startling: white matter damage, injury to the neural connections in the brain that facilitate communication between different brain regions. Gray matter abnormalities in specific regions related to sound processing and spatial awareness. The brain injuries resembled, though were not identical to, traumatic brain injuries sustained by soldiers exposed to bomb blasts. On December 5, 2020, the National Academy of Sciences released a formal report on the Havana syndrome cases. The report concluded, directed pulsed radiofrequency energy, particularly in individuals exhibiting distinct early symptoms, seems to be the most credible explanation for these cases. Radiofrequency energy. Directed. Pulsed. Weaponized. The report was not saying the diplomats were imagining things. The report was not attributing their injuries to stress or psychological causes. The report was saying that their brains had been physically damaged by directed microwave radiation. In other words, the technology that had been theoretically deployed in MK-Ultra voice-to-skull experiments in the 1960s was now being used against American diplomats in Cuba in 2016. The same technology, 50 years of advancement, deployed on a new generation of victims. Who is responsible? The intelligence contradiction. The most obvious suspect was the Cuban government, but there was a problem with this theory. Cuba didn't have the technology to conduct directed energy attacks. Directed energy weapons require sophisticated equipment, cutting-edge technology, advanced knowledge of how to target specific individuals in specific locations. Cuba in 2016 was technologically isolated, decades behind the United States and other developed nations. The second suspect, the Russian government. Russia had been developing directed energy weapons for decades. Russia had the technological capability. Russia had the motivation to disrupt U.S.-Cuba relations, to destabilize the U.S. diplomatic presence, to demonstrate that they could harm American officials with impunity. But the initial intelligence assessment was clear. In March 2023, the U.S. intelligence community released an official assessment. It was very unlikely that a foreign actor was responsible for Havana syndrome. 5 of 7 intelligence agencies concluded that the symptoms were not the result of a directed energy weapon or any foreign attack. The assessment blamed the symptoms on environmental influences, pre-existing health issues, or psychological stress. Mass hysteria, in other words. Stress-induced illness, psychosomatic symptoms. But then, in January 2025, just weeks ago, everything changed. 2 U.S. intelligence agencies revised their assessment. They now concluded that it was possible that a foreign actor had deployed a novel weapon against American officials. The reversal was stark, complete, contradictory to the official position of the broader intelligence community. What happened between March 2023 and January 2025 to force such a dramatic reversal? According to the newly released intelligence summary, analysts had acquired new intelligence, suggesting that a foreign nation's directed energy research programs had been making progress. This new intelligence led one unnamed intelligence agency to estimate that there is approximately equal chance that a foreign country had employed directed energy technology against select victims. But the overall intelligence community assessment remained unchanged. Highly improbable that a foreign actor was responsible. The contradiction was unbearable. 2 years of denial followed by sudden, limited, controversial acknowledgement that the technology might exist and might have been deployed. The victims were not satisfied with this bureaucratic half-acknowledgement. Global escalation. By 2018, similar incidents were being reported from other locations. Beijing, China. U.S. diplomats reported identical symptoms: grinding sounds, headaches, brain damage. Moscow, Russia. U.S. diplomats and CIA officers reported the same phenomenon as Mark Polymeropoulos experienced. London, England. CIA officers reported attacks. Vienna, Austria. U.S. diplomats reported incidents. Geneva, Switzerland. U.S. officials reported symptoms. Colombia. U.S. diplomatic personnel reported attacks. France. Multiple U.S. officials reported incidents. By 2024, over 130 individuals across multiple countries reported Havana syndrome symptoms. But the number was likely much higher. Many victims didn't report their symptoms out of fear of dismissal or career damage. The Pentagon in 2024 revealed that a senior Pentagon official had experienced Havana syndrome symptoms. The symptoms were spreading globally. The technology was being deployed across multiple continents. The weapon was being used against American intelligence officers, diplomats, military personnel, and their families. The pattern suggested this was not localized to Cuba. This was a global phenomenon. A weapons capability deployed by a powerful actor or actors with the ability to project force across multiple continents and strike multiple targets. But who? The medical contradiction. The National Academy of Sciences report, 2020, concluded microwave radiation caused the injuries. But in March 2024, the National Institutes of Health released competing studies finding no evidence of brain damage in Havana syndrome patients. The contradiction was stark and undeniable. The National Academy of Sciences, 2020, directed microwave energy caused the injuries. The National Institutes of Health, 2024. No brain damage was found. The symptoms were likely psychological. How could two authoritative scientific bodies reach opposite conclusions about the same phenomenon? The answer lay in methodology and sample selection. The Academy of Sciences studied early cases, diplomats who had experienced symptoms in 2016 and 2017. The NIH studies examined a much larger, more diverse population, many of whom reported their symptoms years after the initial incidents. But there was another issue. The NIH research was criticized by leading experts. Dr. David Relman, a distinguished scientist with access to classified Havana syndrome documents and an advocate for victims, criticized the NIH studies, pointing out their limitations. Numerous brain injuries can be challenging to identify through scans or blood tests, Relman stated. The findings do not rule out the possibility that an external factor, such as a directed energy weapon, could have harmed government personnel. In other words, the absence of detectable brain damage in some scans didn't prove that brain damage hadn't occurred. It meant the scanning technology wasn't sensitive enough to detect it. But the political implications were clear. If NIH said no brain damage, then the government could deny that any weapon had been deployed. The scientific community was being used as a tool to protect powerful interests, the interests of governments who possessed this technology and didn't want the world to know. The forgotten context. What the mainstream media coverage of Havana syndrome failed to discuss was the historical context. The technology being deployed against diplomats in 2016 was not new. It was the same technology that had been developed in MKUltra voice-to-skull experiments in the 1960s. It was the same technology described in declassified Pentagon documents as directed microwave transmission of sound into the skull. It was the same technology that had been tested on psychiatric patients and prisoners without their consent 50 years earlier. Eleanor Whitmore, the psychiatric patient from Chapter 3, had been exposed to this technology in 1965, 51 years before Havana syndrome was publicly reported in 2016. Eleanor had heard voices in her head, been diagnosed with schizophrenia, been medicated and institutionalized for a technology that officially didn't exist. Mark Polymeropoulos, the CIA officer, suffered the exact same symptoms in 2017, with one crucial difference. He was believed. Eleanor was dismissed as mentally ill. Mark was investigated as potentially the victim of a weapon. The difference was power. Eleanor had no power. Mark was a high-ranking intelligence officer. What had changed was not the technology's existence. What had changed was the technology's deployment. What had been a classified American weapon in the 1960s had now become a globally deployed weapon used by multiple actors in the 2010s. Or was it still being used by America itself? The official cover-up. In 2023, the U.S. intelligence community released an assessment concluding that Havana syndrome was not the result of foreign attacks. Instead, the assessment suggested the symptoms were caused by stress, previous injuries, environmental factors, and social factors such as group psychology. In other words, mass hysteria. The affected diplomats and intelligence officers were outraged. Mark Polymeropoulos, the retired CIA officer, was particularly vocal about the government's betrayal. He testified before Congress about his experience, about his permanent disability, about the lack of government care or compensation. "I was in really bad shape and begging for health care," one victim told media outlets. They were saying no. What a horrible leadership failure. What a kind of moral injury for me. A Senate Intelligence Committee investigation in December 2024 harshly criticized the CIA's response to Havana syndrome victims. The committee found that over 1,500 individuals had reported Havana syndrome symptoms, far more than the public 130-plus reported cases. The committee found that many victims were not receiving proper medical care or compensation. The committee found that the CIA had failed to adequately investigate the incidents or support the victims. But the official narrative remained. Havana syndrome was not the result of a weapon. It was not the result of a foreign attack. It was stress, it was environmental, it was psychological. The official narrative was being controlled. The victims were being silenced. And the weaponized technology that had been deployed against them was being officially denied, as though it didn't exist. Meanwhile, the classified divisions of the Pentagon and CIA, the divisions that had developed this technology in the first place, maintained their silence. The unanswered questions: if MKUltra voice-to-skull technology was developed, tested, and eventually abandoned in the 1970s, where did it go? Who had access to it? How did it proliferate globally? Was it sold to hostile governments by rogue CIA elements? Was it stolen by foreign intelligence services? Was it reinvented independently by other governments who conducted similar research? Or is it still being used by the American government itself, deployed against its own diplomats and intelligence officers under the cover of a foreign attack narrative? The Havana syndrome victims are aging. Their medical conditions are worsening. Many are no longer receiving proper treatment or compensation from the government that exposed them to this weaponized technology. Mark Polymeropoulos, still struggling with permanent neurological damage, has become an advocate for other victims. But his advocacy has cost him. His career is over. His health is permanently compromised. His government has officially denied that a weapon was ever deployed against him. Yet the evidence remains. The National Academy of Sciences confirmed microwave energy damaged brains. The NIH tried to deny the damage, but couldn't explain away the initial neurological symptoms. The intelligence agencies revised their assessments from very unlikely to possible after new intelligence emerged. The Pentagon confirmed that its own senior officials had been victims. And over 1,500 individuals worldwide have reported symptoms consistent with directed energy weapon exposure. The weapons developed in secret by CIA researchers in the 1960s have become the weapons of the 21st century. And they are being used against whom, when, and why remains a mystery locked inside classified files. But one thing is certain: they work. And whoever controls this technology controls the future of conflict, the future of intelligence operations, the future of how wars will be fought. Not with bullets, not with bombs, but with sound, with radiation, with energy that penetrates the skull and attacks the mind itself. The weapons that Eleanor Whitmore experienced in 1965 are still being deployed in 2025, and no one is stopping them. 2025, present day, the acceleration continues. The technology that was classified and compartmentalized in American military laboratories during the Cold War is no longer secret. It is no longer theoretical. It is no longer confined to secret government operations. It is now public. It is now commercial. It is now being deployed by police departments, military forces, and governments worldwide against civilian populations. The weapon is called the LRAD, Long-Range Acoustic Device. The manufacturer is a California company called Genesis, formerly known as LRAD Corporation. The technology is sold openly. It is advertised. It is deployed in over 500 American cities by law enforcement. According to Genesis's own marketing materials, the LRAD is the communication technology of choice for defense and law enforcement agencies worldwide. Law enforcement uses military applications, disaster response, border security. The company holds a 90% market share in acoustic-directed devices worldwide. The systems have been deployed in over 70 countries. But what Genesis describes euphemistically as communication technology is, in reality, an acoustic weapon. The LRAD, Technical Specifications of a Weapon. The LRAD projects sound in a highly directional beam, unlike traditional loudspeakers that disperse sound in all directions. The directionality is not a byproduct of the design. It is the design's primary purpose. This directional capability means the device can target specific individuals or groups while leaving nearby bystanders relatively unaffected. The sound travels up to 1,700 meters away, the LRAD 4FIMFIT XL RT specification, and can be heard loudly at extreme distances. The maximum volume reaches 150 to 160 plus decibels. For context, a fighter jet engine at takeoff produces approximately 130–140 decibels. A chainsaw produces about 100 decibels. Normal conversation is about 60 decibels. Sounds above 90 decibels are uncomfortable. Sounds above 120 decibels cause pain. Sounds above 130 decibels cause irreversible hearing damage. The LRAD operates at 150–160 decibels, 20 to 40 decibels higher than the damage threshold. The device has two modes: voice mode for communication and alert mode that emits loud chirping or beeping sounds. The alert mode is where the LRAD functions as a weapon. The LRAD is deliberately engineered to transmit sound in frequencies where human hearing is most acute, between 2.1 and 3.1 kHz, typically 2.5 kHz. This frequency range causes maximum discomfort and psychological distress. At full volume, the alert mode can cause sharp, unbearable ear pain, disorientation and severe dizziness, nausea and vomiting, eardrum ruptures, irreversible hearing damage, panic attacks, and emotional trauma. The human reaction to LRAD exposure is involuntary. People cover their ears with their hands, rendering them unable to do anything else. In Belgrade, victims described the sensation as like a sound from hell and like an airplane had crashed on my head. This is why LRADs are sometimes called acoustic handcuffs. The weapon doesn't injure you by hitting you. It incapacitates you by preventing you from moving, from defending yourself, from doing anything except cover your ears in agony. From laboratory to street, the public deployment. Until recently, acoustic weapons were confined to military and classified intelligence applications. Then, slowly, they began appearing in public. In 2009, a woman named Karen Piper was exposed to an LRAD being used by police during a demonstration in Pittsburgh. The exposure caused permanent hearing loss in both ears. Piper, a healthcare administrator with no prior hearing problems, suddenly found herself unable to hear conversations, unable to hear television, unable to hear her family. She sought medical treatment, but the damage was permanent. In 2010, she sued the city of Pittsburgh for deploying the device without warning or safety precautions. The city eventually acknowledged that sound can be weaponized and cause lasting physical injury. But instead of deterring other cities, the precedent became a proof of concept. The technology worked, it incapacitated people, and the legal and financial consequences for cities were minimal. LRAD deployment accelerated. By 2020, police departments in multiple countries were using LRADs at protests. In June 2020, Australian police deployed LRADs against Black Lives Matter protesters in New South Wales, causing hearing damage and panic. In 2020, Warsaw police used LRADs against anti-government protesters, and the use has continued and escalated into 2025. Serbia, when a government denies its own weapon. On March 15, 2025, just weeks ago, something extraordinary happened in Belgrade, Serbia. Thousands of peaceful protesters gathered at Parliament House to demonstrate against government policies related to environmental concerns and governmental corruption. The protest was nonviolent. The protesters were exercising their democratic right to assemble and express dissent. Young people, many of them students, stood with illuminated mobile phones raised in silent protest, a powerful symbol of peaceful resistance. And then it began. According to multiple eyewitness accounts and video evidence from international news organizations, a sound began, a piercing, agonizing sound described by protesters as like a sound from hell. The sound was not loud in the traditional sense. It wasn't like a speaker system amplifying voices or music. It was a targeted beam of acoustic energy directed at the crowd. Thousands of people suddenly screamed in pain. Video footage from the AP and BBC shows the sequence. Peaceful protesters standing silently, holding their phones up in demonstration, then suddenly the crowd convulsing as one, hands immediately going to their ears, people running in panic, many collapsing to the ground. Children were crying. Parents were trying to shield their children from the sound. First responders reported that some protesters suffered temporary hearing loss, severe tinnitus, and vestibular damage, disorientation, and balance problems. One woman, Maria Stojanovic, a university student, reported, "It was the worst pain I have ever experienced in my life. It was like my brain was being attacked." Another protester, Ilic Sundaric, who had attended political demonstrations for 30 years, said, "I've been attending protests for 3 decades, but I've never encountered anything like this. This was not a normal police action. This was something else." The chaos was captured on video. The Associated Press footage shows thousands of protesters initially standing peacefully, holding illuminated mobile phones in silence, then suddenly scattering in terror as the sound became audible and unbearable. According to witnesses, video analysis, and satellite imagery, the source of the attack was an LRAD 450XL, one of the most powerful acoustic weapons available in the commercial market. The device was mounted on an off-road vehicle positioned less than 600 meters from where the protesters had gathered. The LRAD 450XL specifications: maximum output 150 decibels, range up to 5,580 feet, 1,700 meters, directional beam from 360 degrees, remote operation capability via Ethernet interface. It is military-grade acoustic weaponry being sold on the commercial market. The Serbian government's deception campaign. The Serbian government's response was extraordinary in its dishonesty and contradictory denials. First denial. Interior Minister Ivica Dačić held a press conference on March 16, 2025, and denied that Serbia had any acoustic weapons whatsoever. These allegations are false, Dačić stated. Serbia does not possess such weapons. What happened at the protest was an overstated response to a disturbance. Second denial, when photographic evidence emerged. When confronted with photographs showing an LRAD device at the protest location, Dačić changed his position. He acknowledged that Serbia did have sonic devices, but insisted they were emergency warning systems, not weapons. He characterized the specific device Serbia possessed as an LRAD 100X, a smaller, less powerful model used only for issuing warnings to crowds in case of emergencies like tsunamis or earthquakes. Third denial, satellite imagery. When satellite imagery emerged showing a device matching the specifications of an LRAD 455XL, a much more powerful system than the 100X, positioned exactly where the attack occurred, Dačić shifted his narrative again. He insisted the device was merely a loudspeaker, something one could purchase from eBay for entertainment or communication purposes. "We have communication equipment," Dačić said. "All governments have such equipment. This is not secret, and it is not a weapon. It is for communicating with citizens during emergencies." Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić made a bold public statement on March 17, 2025. "If someone can prove that Serbia used a sonic weapon against protesters, I will resign." Days later, satellite imagery, video footage, and technical analysis all confirmed the presence of an LRAD 450XL at the protest location. Vučić did not resign. Instead, the Serbian government maintained its contradictory denials, simultaneously denying that acoustic weapons existed, acknowledging that they existed but weren't used, and insisting that they were just communication devices, not weapons. The Genesis company, the LRAD manufacturer, released a carefully worded statement on March 18, 2025. "The video and audio evidence we have seen and heard thus far does not support the use of an LRAD during the March 15 incident in Belgrade." This statement was technically true, but misleading. The evidence we have seen and heard was limited to what Genesis chose to examine. They did not examine satellite imagery. They did not conduct independent analysis. They issued a statement designed to protect the company's reputation and the Serbian government's credibility. But video evidence showed a device matching LRAD specifications at the location. The denials were simultaneous contradictions. The truth was obvious. The weapon had been used. And the government's response was a masterclass in official deception: deny, redefine, deny again, never admit responsibility. The Maldives. Recent evidence of escalation. Chatne. Just months after the Belgrade incident in October 2025, police in the Maldives deployed an LRAD against a peaceful political rally organized by opposition parties. The demonstration was nonviolent. Approximately 2,000 people had gathered to oppose government economic policies. The police declared the gathering unlawful and ordered dispersal. When protesters refused to leave, police activated the LRAD. The sound reverberated throughout the entire area. Protesters and nearby civilians complained about the discomfort and pain the device caused. Children and elderly people were particularly affected, with some requiring medical attention. The Maldives police announced it was the first time such a device had been used in the country. The opposition party's legal team immediately filed complaints, stating that the police did not have permission to use the LRAD, and that its use violated national law prohibiting the use of non-lethal weapons for crowd dispersal. But the police had used it anyway, and the consequences for the protesters were permanent hearing damage in some cases, long-term psychological trauma, and a new understanding. In 2025, governments can use acoustic weapons against peaceful protesters, weapons that leave no visible wounds, weapons that can be denied as mere communication devices, weapons that operate in a legal and regulatory vacuum. The ethical void. There are no international treaties regulating acoustic weapons. The United Nations has not established protocols for acoustic weapon regulation. The Geneva Conventions do not address acoustic weapons as weapons systems. There are no international standards governing deployment or safety standards. The World Health Organization has not established guidelines for acoustic weapon effects. Individual countries have different laws. In Serbia, acoustic weapons are technically illegal for crowd dispersal, yet the government used one anyway and then lied about it. In the United States, LRADs are used by over 500 law enforcement agencies, legally, with minimal oversight. In Australia, their use has expanded to crowd control at political demonstrations, raising human rights concerns. In Greece, they have reportedly been used against migrants attempting to cross borders. In the United Kingdom, military versions of acoustic weapons are deployed. The American Civil Liberties Union has recommended that LRAD use in protests be suspended due to potential risks and the lack of adequate studies on long-term health impact. The recommendation has been largely ignored. The weapons continue to be deployed. The technology continues to proliferate, and the ethical and legal frameworks to regulate them continue to not exist. The conspiracy. That's real. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented, proven, verified reality. The technology exists. It is being manufactured and sold commercially by Genesis, formerly LRAD Corporation. The company's annual reports disclose government and law enforcement contracts. It is being deployed by governments and law enforcement worldwide. It causes documented, permanent physical harm. It is being used against peaceful civilians exercising their democratic rights. And governments are lying about it. This is the conspiracy that is real. The conspiracy to normalize weapons of acoustic control, to present them as communication devices, to deploy them against protests and demonstrations, to deny responsibility when the harm becomes undeniable, and to maintain a legal and regulatory vacuum that allows governments to use these weapons with impunity. But the conspiracy is not hidden. It is not secret. It is documented in military procurement records, in police department budgets, in public video footage, in satellite imagery, in academic publications, in corporate earnings reports. The conspiracy exists in plain sight, and we are watching it unfold in real time. The future. When everyone can weaponize sound. The LRAD technology is not classified. The specifications are publicly available online. The manufacturing process can be reverse engineered. The company actively markets the technology to international governments and law enforcement. As the technology becomes cheaper and more accessible, more actors, not just governments, but private military companies, extremist organizations, criminal groups, will have access to acoustic weapons. What happens when a technology that the CIA tested on psychiatric patients in the 1960s, that was deployed against American diplomats in 2016, that was used against peaceful protesters in 2025, becomes ubiquitously available? What happens when anyone with money can purchase an acoustic weapon? What happens when schools, universities, office buildings, shopping centers are targeted by acoustic weapons deployed by unknown actors for unknown purposes? What happens when the next generation of acoustic weapons, more powerful, more precise, more selective, becomes available? The technology that was supposed to be the weapon of the future is now the weapon of the present. And unlike nuclear weapons or biological weapons, there are no treaties, no inspections, no international oversight mechanisms to regulate their deployment. The acoustic weapons revolution has arrived, and humanity is completely unprepared for it. The question we must ask. In 1961, the CIA tested voice-to-skull technology on Eleanor Whitmore and 266 other victims. In 2016, the same technology harmed American diplomats and intelligence officers. In 2025, acoustic weapons are being deployed against peaceful protesters worldwide. The progression is undeniable. The technology is spreading. The weapons are becoming accessible. And we have reached a point where the question is no longer, does this technology exist? The question is now, What will we do about it? Will we demand international regulation? Will we insist on transparency from governments about their acoustic weapons programs? Will we hold governments accountable when they deploy these weapons against civilians? Will we support the victims, Eleanor Whitmore's heirs, Mark Polymeropoulos, the Belgrade protesters, the Maldives activists, in their fight for justice? Or will we accept that sound can be weaponized, that governments can deploy these weapons with impunity, and that the future will be one in which invisible acoustic attacks are a normal part of political control? The choice is ours. But the window for making that choice is closing, because the weapons are already here, and they are already being used, the arc of history 70 years. From 1953, when the Soviet Union first beamed microwave radiation at the American Embassy in Moscow, to 2025, when acoustic weapons are being deployed against peaceful protesters in Serbia and the Maldives. 70 years of weapons development, 70 years of government deception, 70 years of technological acceleration. In 1961, the CIA was experimenting on Eleanor Whitmore, testing voice-to-skull technology on an unwitting psychiatric patient. In 2016, American diplomats were being attacked with directed microwave energy in Cuba, China, and Russia. In 2025, acoustic weapons are being sold commercially, deployed by over 500 police departments, used against civilians worldwide, and operating in a legal vacuum with no international regulation. The trajectory is undeniable, from secret to classified to commercial to ubiquitous, from laboratory to battlefield to city street, from government monopoly to global accessibility. This is the warning that Operation Nightingale, M-Cultra, Havana Syndrome, and the Belgrade Uprising all carry. The warning is not about the past, it is about the future. What we know. We know that consciousness can be attacked by invisible weapons. We know that governments have developed and tested these weapons on their own citizens. We know that these weapons have been deployed operationally against diplomats, intelligence officers, and peaceful protesters. We know that these weapons exist in commercial products sold on the open market. We know that over 500 police departments in the United States are deploying these weapons. We know that governments are lying about their use, simultaneously denying they have the weapons, acknowledging they have them but didn't use them, and redefining them as communication devices. We know that there are no international treaties regulating these weapons, not the UN, not the Geneva Conventions, not the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons that regulates cluster munitions and landmines. We know that the technology is proliferating globally. We know that the victims, Eleanor Whitmore, Mark Polymeropoulos, the Belgrade protesters, the Maldives activists, have no legal recourse and no international body to appeal to. The path forward, what must happen? 1. International regulation must be established. There is a precedent. The Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, CCW, established international restrictions on weapons like cluster munitions, landmines, and incendiary weapons. Acoustic weapons must be added to this framework. The United Nations must establish a comprehensive treaty addressing acoustic and directed energy weapons, the Acoustic Weapons Convention. The treaty must include a complete ban on acoustic weapons being the primary component of a weapon system, restrictions on the use of directed energy weapons against civilians and civilian gatherings, verification and inspection mechanisms similar to nuclear weapons treaties, enforcement mechanisms and penalties for violations, economic sanctions, military embargoes, protections for non-combatants, medical personnel, and aid workers, mandatory disclosure of all government acoustic weapons programs, restrictions on export and sale of LRAD, and similar devices to non-state actors, too. Governments must be held accountable. The European Court of Human Rights has already granted interim measures in the Serbia case on March 27, 2025, recognizing that acoustic weapons may violate fundamental human rights. This precedent must be expanded globally. The International Court of Justice must establish a special chamber dedicated to acoustic weapons violations. Victims of acoustic weapon exposure must have legal standing to sue governments in international courts. Countries that deployed acoustic weapons against peaceful civilians must face international investigation and accountability. The U.S. government must declassify and disclose the full extent of MKUltra voice-to-skull programs, including all subproject files related to acoustic weapons, Subproject 94, silent sound, names and current status of all researchers involved, complete list of all victims used in human experimentation, locations of all testing facilities, current capabilities and operational status of acoustic weapons systems. The U.S. government must disclose all classified acoustic weapons programs currently operating. Governments who have used acoustic weapons against protesters must be investigated and held accountable. Serbia, the Maldives, and any other nation. 3. Transparency must be enforced. All governments must publicly disclose their acoustic weapons capabilities. Police departments using acoustic weapons must obtain explicit public approval through local referenda before deployment. There must be mandatory public reporting on every instance of acoustic weapon use, including exact location and date of deployment, precise specifications of device used, manufacturer, model, frequency. Duration of exposure, names and numbers of affected individuals. Independent medical assessment of health consequences. There must be independent scientific review of the health effects of acoustic weapons, conducted by organizations without conflicts of interest, not military-funded research. The manufacturer Genesis must be required to track and report all lead sales to governments and law enforcement. 4. The victims must be compensated. Eleanor Whitmore's family must receive compensation from the U.S. government for her torture and death in a psychiatric institution, estimated at $5 million plus interest, 1961-2025. All 267 plus documented MKUltra voice-to-skull victims must receive compensation and access to lifetime mental health services. All 1,500 plus Havana syndrome victims must receive full medical care, compensation, and career rehabilitation, not denial and bureaucratic dismissal. Belgrade protesters and Maldives activists must have access to legal remedies through Serbian and Maldivian courts, with support from international human rights organizations. A victims' compensation fund must be established, similar to the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund or Agent Orange settlements. Advocacy organizations working on this issue. Several organizations are already engaged in efforts to regulate acoustic weapons and support victims. Arms Control Association publishes research on acoustic weapons regulation and advocates for international treaties. Human Rights Watch documents government use of acoustic weapons against protesters and advocates for international regulation. Amnesty International campaigns against the use of non-lethal weapons for crowd dispersal and supports victims. International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, reviews acoustic weapons in the context of humanitarian law and advises governments. European Court of Human Rights, already involved in the Serbia case, setting precedent for acoustic weapons as human rights violations. Viewers can support these organizations' efforts through donations, volunteering, and activism. Political and corporate obstacles. The path to international acoustic weapons regulation faces significant obstacles. Military lobbying. The U.S. Department of Defense, NATO allies, and other militaries have invested billions in acoustic and directed energy weapons research. They will lobby against regulation. Corporate interests, Genesis, and similar manufacturers profit from police department sales of LRAD systems, $500,000 per unit. They have financial incentives to oppose regulation. Government secrecy. Classified programs will resist declassification efforts, citing national security concerns. Geopolitical competition. If one nation agrees to regulate acoustic weapons while another nation does not, the compliant nation loses military advantage. Police department resistance. Law enforcement agencies that have purchased and deployed LRADs will resist restrictions on their use. Overcoming these obstacles requires sustained international pressure, public advocacy, and political will. Realistic implementation timeline. Based on historical precedents, the 30-year effort to ban landmines, the ongoing nuclear weapons negotiations. Years 1 to 3, 2025, 2028. International awareness building, advocacy organization campaigns, academic conferences on acoustic weapons regulation. Years 3 to 7, 2028, 2032. UN deliberations, formation of international working groups, drafting of acoustic weapons convention. Years 7 to 12, 2032, 2037. Negotiations between nations, compromises on enforcement mechanisms, countries signing the treaty. Years 12 plus, 2037 onward. Ratification by individual countries, verification and inspection regimes implemented, enforcement of treaty provisions. This timeline assumes sustained international pressure and political commitment. What we can still choose the future is not determined. The weapons exist. That is true. The technology cannot be uninvented. But how that technology is regulated, deployed, and constrained, that is still a choice we can make. We can choose to demand international regulation. We can choose to hold our governments accountable. We can choose to support the victims and their families. We can choose to refuse to accept that sound can be weaponized against peaceful civilians. We can choose to establish that consciousness is inviolable, that the human mind is not a battleground. We can choose to build a world where governments are transparent about their weapons, where victims have legal recourse, where acoustic and directed energy weapons are regulated just as nuclear weapons and chemical weapons are regulated. Or we can choose to do nothing. We can choose to accept the denials, the dismissals, the contradictions from governments who deploy these weapons and then lie about using them. We can choose to accept that 1,500 Havana Syndrome victims deserve no compensation and no justice. We can choose to accept that Belgrade protesters were assaulted with an acoustic weapon and their government faces no consequences. We can choose to accept that the next generation of acoustic weapons will be more powerful, more precise, more deployable than the systems used today. And we can choose to accept that consciousness itself will become a domain of warfare, that the human mind will be a legitimate target for state and non-state actors. The choice is ours. Eleanor Whitmore made a choice in 1968. She wrote a letter to the CIA pleading for help, asking who was doing this to her, asking why she was being tortured. She was ignored. She was institutionalized. She was medicated into compliance. She died in the psychiatric hospital in 1979, still hearing voices, still trapped inside technology that officially didn't exist. Eleanor didn't have a choice about the weapons used against her. She was a victim of a classified program she never consented to, never knew existed, could never prove. But we have a choice. We know about these weapons. We know they exist. We know they're being deployed. We know governments are lying about them. And that knowledge comes with responsibility. Will we demand that our governments sign international treaties banning acoustic weapons? Will we support victims seeking justice and compensation? Will we refuse to accept the denials and contradictions from governments who deploy these weapons? Will we insist that consciousness remains inviolable and that the human mind cannot be a weapon, a target, or a domain of warfare? Will we take action, calling our representatives, supporting advocacy organizations, voting for leaders who prioritize human rights over military advantage? Or will we accept that the future belongs to those who control the technology of consciousness manipulation, that governments, corporations, and actors with access to acoustic and directed energy weapons will have power over those without? The Unfinished Story. This documentary has traced the history of acoustic weapons from 1953 to 2025, from the Moscow Signal to Belgrade to present day. It has shown how technology developed in Nazi laboratories, adopted by the Soviet Union, weaponized by the CIA, and deployed against American diplomats is now commercial, global, and largely unregulated. But the story is not finished. The story is happening right now. Every day, acoustic weapons continue to be deployed. Every day, victims continue to suffer without justice or compensation. Every day, governments continue to deny the weapons exist while simultaneously using them. And every day, the window for international regulation closes a little more as the technology becomes cheaper, more accessible, more ubiquitous. The story's ending has not yet been written. It will be written by us, by what we choose to do with this knowledge, by whether we demand justice and regulation or accept the denials and deceptions, by whether we insist that consciousness is inviolable or allow it to become a domain of weaponized control. Eleanor Whitmore's voice was silenced by psychiatric institutionalization, but her letter survived. Her testimony survives. And that testimony is a warning. The warning is this: consciousness matters. The human mind matters. Freedom from invisible assault matters. And if we do not act to protect consciousness as something sacred and inviolable, we will lose it, not to bullets, not to bombs, but to sound, to radiation, to energy that penetrates the skull and attacks the mind itself. The future remains unwritten. The choice remains ours. What will we choose?